All right, welcome everyone to our Cyberwise Chat. So happy to have you here. We're going to start slowly because I know people are still logging on. I'm Diana Graber, author of Raising Humans in a Digital World and founder of Cyber Civics and Cyberwise, here as always with Dr. Pamela Rutledge, who is the director of the Media Psychology Research Center. We're really excited today to talk with Doctors Emily Weinstein and I did it. I just asked you how to pronounce your name, and I probably did it wrong. Sorry,
No, that was right.
Yeah, you did it.
Woo. And Dr. Carrie James. They're Harvard researchers and the authors of a really good new book. I'm going to put it really close so you can see it. Behind Their Screens, What Teens Are Facing and Adults Are Missing. I was really excited to read this book, particularly because their research is based on talking with real teens. And that's so important today, that teen voice is not heard enough when it comes to this topic. We were just talking before we started this chat about, here we are, 4 grown white women talking about what teens are facing. So we really want to let you know that today's conversation is going to be based on what the teens think, what they want you to know, and hopefully you'll leave with those takeaways today. So that's really where I want to start today. I'm going to turn to you two to tell us what informed your research. How did you do your research? How many teens did you talk to? Maybe give us a little lay of the land before we get started.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having us. So I'm a psychologist, Carrie's a sociologist. We have been doing this research on teens and screens together and separately for a little over a decade. And this project was honestly inspired because we were working on a project that we just ended up with this absolute treasure trove of data. We were conducting a survey and we ended up with survey responses from just over 3,500 middle and high schoolers who attended 15 different schools across 10 different US states from really different contexts. And we started looking at the data, and there was one question in particular on the survey that was about what worries you about growing up with today's technologies, what worries you about growing up in today's digital world. And we had asked questions about the positives and the upsides as well, but we found that this question, we started looking at the responses from youth, and they just stopped us in our tracks. We kept turning to each other like, are you seeing this? Are you hearing this? We realized pretty quickly that we wanted to make sure that we were understanding and interpreting with as much of a team level view as possible. So we actually assembled a teen advisory council of 22 teens who were not part of the initial survey, but who were also from diverse identities and backgrounds and contexts. And we worked with them over several months, really analyzing the data, co-interpreting, asking them what other context we needed to make sure we were getting the story right. And we wrote this book to share what we learned, to share so many different things that we saw in the data that even 10 years into engaging with these topics every single day, we felt like, oh my gosh, we have assumptions that are just missing the mark. So other people must also. And it was really a joy to get to put them on paper and share them with others.
That's
great. That's amazing. So the topics that you then covered in the book, the way you organized the book, are those themes that emerge from the interviews with the teens or from the analysis of the survey data?
It was a mix of both. So at the top level, well, I'll just name the topics that we cover in the book for those of you who haven't taken a peek yet. So we cover tech habits and the pull of the screen. We have a chapter dedicated to friendship dilemmas. That's just a real eye-opener because we often think of the positives of friendship, and those are definitely there, but there are also more subtle dilemmas and pressures around friendship in an always-on age. We get into cyberbullying and meanness and the more subtle forms that can take in today's connected world. We talk about sexting pressures and the different aspects of teens' social lives with peers that impinge on their decisions around whether or not to send a nude to someone. We have a chapter focused on civic and political life and how that is a big part of what teens are experiencing in their social media worlds. And then, of course, the topic that parents often fret about, which is the digital footprint. And it's really interesting if you think about these topics, they're they are top line topics that you would expect that adults worry about. And a big sort of overarching theme across the book is that teens worry about them too. But the details are different in terms of what their experiences are with these topics, the reasons why they sometimes behave in ways or make choices that appear to us like irrational choices, like posting something that in the future could come back to bite you. We peel back the layers and reveal a lot of the complexity behind their decision making. So we cover an array of topics, but we feel like we've done a great job in looking really carefully and closely behind teen screens, hearing and putting forth their stories and perspectives about how hard it is to grow up in a digital age. And let me just say on that point, one of the reasons why it's hard is because there are also so many enormous positives contained in their devices. So it's not like it's an easy choice to walk away. It doesn't feel optional. There are great parts and there are really challenging parts.
I love the word complex, because that would be what I walked away after reading the book, is a complex world that we're throwing these kids into. But we'll get to that in a minute. I would like to hear from each of you, just one quick answer. What was your biggest surprise when writing this book? What's the biggest surprise that you learned from the teens?
Oh, there are so many. It's hard to say just one. I think one that we've just kept coming back to that felt really compelling and interesting to us was around a sort of hidden side or even a reframe of the adolescent mental health crisis. So obviously there's a lot of attention to adolescent mental health trends and many questions about the role of social media. And, we've been asking those questions in our own research too. Something that we hadn't really appreciated until we started working on this project was that a reality of living in this current context is that even if you are an adolescent who is not yourself struggling with your own mental health in a big way right at this moment, you are more likely than ever to have friends and peers who are struggling. And because of social media and because of the affordances of these platforms, many of those peers are struggling in public or in semi-public spaces. They might be posting on social media, or they might be seeking help from their friends over texting and figuring out, number one, how do I interpret the post that I see when something is really alarming, when I need to actually act on it or involve an adult or someone else. But also when I have a friend who's struggling, how do I manage the boundaries around my own self-care, disconnecting when I need to, and also being available to be a good friend and be supportive? And, Carrie and I have been saying that's really a big burden on young shoulders, and one that I think we hadn't really appreciated or put ourselves in the perspective of what must it feel like to not only be a teen who's really struggling, but a teen who is a friend to people who are struggling, a peer to people who are struggling in this context.
And let me just ask as a follow-on. So do you think because there's all these conversations and because there's this awareness, is it also in normalizing mental health as something that it's okay to talk about and okay to seek help for when you see people struggling publicly? Is that sort of, silver lining of sorts to that whole exposure?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both and, right? There are, because we know that there are pockets of the internet and communities on social media where a huge part of what's helping is sharing coping strategies and normalizing the struggle and sharing language for even the ways people talk about their emotions. That's basic social emotional learning. That's great. We also know that there are really dark sides to these communities, and there are really deeply concerning aspects, pockets of each of these social media platforms around different mental health challenges that can certainly amplify and exacerbate issues. So I think it's really both of those things, and that part of that complexity is also just a reality of what teens are facing.
One thing to build on what Emily was saying, and then I'll share another thing that surprised us is, so often we think about how technologies can undercut our sense of empathy for others. They create a distance between ourselves and others. But this set of findings around these pulls to the screen and this need to be there for friends really shows that empathy is a source of a lot of dilemmas that young people are facing. When their friends are struggling, they want to be there for them. They want to be a good friend, and that can pose all kinds of dilemmas and challenges.
I
So
love
let
that
me
part of the book. I just want to say that I love that because I think sometimes as adults we worry that there's a lack of empathy online, and I think this shows that kids are struggling with that, that they want to show empathy, but we don't give them support to know how. For them to have to deal with mental health problems without us equipping them with strategies to do so, I think is asking so much of our young people.
It's
Yeah.
extremely hard. I mean, if you put yourself like in the position of imagining like whatever platform you use, maybe it's like Facebook, but imagine that like you go on Facebook and you see someone who's like a friend from your past, but not part of your active life right now. And they post something and you're like, are they okay? Like, that seems like a little concerning. Maybe maybe that person is struggling. Even as an adult, it's really hard to figure out like, what is my role? Like, should I
Right.
step in? Should I do it publicly? Should I privately message them? And like, when is something just maybe the way that they're venting versus actually like really a cry for help? I think when we actually put ourselves like in the perspective of being a teen trying to manage these sort of posts, suddenly we're like, oh yeah, that is extremely hard. And like I, as an adult and as a mom, and especially like, I want to be alongside my kids in those decisions, not just, not shutting the door to those conversations before we've even started them.
Yeah. And plus, if we equip our kids, think of all the kids we can save. You know what I mean? Like they're helping each other. So there's this cry in the dark is no longer in the dark, which is kind of a wonderful upside of the whole thing.
Right. And I know I was going to raise the other theme, but I don't want to leave folks who are listening hanging in terms of what we can do as adults, as parents, when we see our kids feeling pulled and feeling this dilemma. One thing we often, we've collaborated for a long time with Common Sense Media and Common Sense Education, and they've built into the curriculum this idea of red flag feelings. And when, that red flag, when you know something's not quite right, like that, what Emily just described, you see something that seems like a cry for help, but you're not sure. And so really helping our kids be alert to those red flag feelings and don't just scroll on, turn to a trusted friend, ideally a trusted adult for help. All the weight should not be on young shoulders. And the other thing we can do is really help our kids develop language around setting boundaries, boundaries that are kind and caring, but also firm when you need to disconnect for your own self-care, when you need to disconnect for sleep and some of the other essentials is really key.
And Carrie, did you have one big surprise?
Oh, yes. So the other surprise that I wanted to raise is, it's in the category of more of meanness and cyberbullying. And cyberbullying as a phenomenon is often on adults and schools' radars. We have pretty clear definitions of what counts as cyberbullying, and there is a lot of support and attention to it. But in listening to teens, we heard that a lot of what is part of their experience and what's so hard falls more in the category of subtle jabs or ambiguous slights. And so teens told us things about being strategically cropped out of a photo from a social event. So like a photo goes up and they're cropped out, or they're the only person in the photo who's not tagged, and being left to wonder, like, was this intentional? Is there a message in there? Another area where teens puzzle is even over the ambiguity of being left on read in a text messaging exchange. So you send a message to a friend and you're left on read, and they didn't reciprocate, they didn't respond, and you're left to wonder, what's going on? Is my friend mad at me? Have I done something wrong? And this is where the sort of norms around the immediacy of response can get us into trouble, because we end up doing a little bit of mind reading. But for adolescents who are so primed to care about their friends and their friendships and know what their friends are thinking, that can be really, really hard. So these like tech-fueled dynamics are really meaningful to teens. We think about features like snap maps on the Snapchat app, where you can see all of your friends' avatars and where they are in real space and time. And you can look on that map and realize all your friends are clustered together and know that you haven't been invited, that you've been left out in some way. So this TMI, like too much information, really creates a lot of puzzles for adolescents who are primed to really care about all that information.
And I would build on that. it's confusing for kids and there's a lot of subtlety and ambiguity. And when parents try to read into it, it's almost impossible. And I see so many parents that call things cyberbullying so quickly because they don't really understand all those nuances and the inside joke and all the things that built to it. So I think that just really speaks to having to have a conversation with your kids and not read into their online, whatever's going on, unless you really understand the context and try to talk to your child about it.
And I
That's
think that
true.
that leads, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that just sort of leads into, so where we're sort of thinking of the next question, which is how different parents and teens' interpretations of events are. And I have to say, as a sidebar, I'm not sure adults are any better at setting boundaries online than teens, so they're not getting a lot of good modeling in that regard. But how do you recommend that parents shift their lens so that what they're looking at is not sort of their own sort of knee jerk or their own context, but that they're starting to have, call it empathy for their teens' point of view?
Okay, well, I'll answer that, but we should definitely circle back to the modeling point because that is such a big one. And I think a huge thing that's impacting Carrie and my own parenting from doing this research. But a huge focus of the way we have come to think about being researchers in this space is the importance of not just seeing what teens see on their screen. Obviously, the content is really important, but we've come to appreciate that what we really need to do is see it as they do. We need to be able to really understand what they see and interpret when they're seeing content on their screens. And there are so many reasons for this, but one is that teens tell us again and again, the same content that in one context might be really nice, in another context is really hostile, or a comment that looks hostile is actually really interpreted as being super flattering. And we cannot understand what the emotional aftermath is going to be for a teen if we don't understand how they're interpreting what they see. There are so many interesting examples of this, but one really simple one is we started hearing that things like hostile liking. Imagine that someone goes through all of your old Instagram photos and likes every single one, but it's someone who you kind of have beef with. And what you're interpreting it as is that that person is actually saying I'm watching you. I'm in your space. I see you, I see what you're doing. And so something all of a sudden I get 32 likes from you on all my past photos. And I'm interpreting that as a threat or as something that's very hostile, which could be totally different than I have a new friend and she goes through and likes all my old photos in order to say oh, I love all your old content. I want to be part of your life. You're so awesome. So the same behaviors can just take on such different meanings. I just want to say one more thing about this, which is we are seeing so clearly in the research that toxic social comparison is really important if we want to understand when certain kinds of passive browsing on social media make kids feel bad in ways that have real meaningful effects for their well-being, short-term and longer term. One of the things that we heard and saw from teens in our research is that the same content that provokes that feeling of toxic comparison for one teen has a completely different experience for another. And I think we tell the story in the book, but there's one example of this that I always think of when Carrie and I were talking to a teen boy, and he was talking, a few teens were talking about influencers posting when they have bad skin days. And how for some teens, they look at that content and they're this is so normalizing and empowering. Yeah, you don't have to have perfect skin to be, people get breakouts and blemishes, and that's totally fine. And then we had another teen who's yeah, but last night, someone who I follow, who's an influencer, posted their bad skin day, and they were see, I have bad skin days too. And he's I'm looking at that and I'm that is what my skin looks like on my best day. So I must be really ugly. I must be really hideous. If that's this, if you're trying to normalize photo is better than my bad, it's better than my best self. And Carrie and I just kept having these kinds of moments like that, where we were yeah, gosh, you just have to, if we want to have their backs, we have to see through their eyes.
That's a great line.
One approach we use in our research, which works better when you're a researcher talking to a teen and you're not their parent, but it can work for parents. So one thing we do is co-browsing. So we have someone open up an app whether it be Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok. And we're seeing exactly what they're seeing, but having them narrate what they see and what they think about it and how they feel as a result of it can be incredibly powerful. If you have a kid who's more of an open book, that can actually be really effective. A lot of kids don't want to do that with their parents, and we acknowledge that. And so there are other ways to talk with them about content that may be distressing, or, you know, in a way, opening your own phone and narrating out loud the kinds of things you see, like, wow, everyone looks like they're leading their best lives. Like, that can't really be true, can it? Like, sort of modeling that kind of media literacy angle, or normalizing some of the stressors and feelings that we have, to create an open conversation where they feel like they can bring some of those pain points to the fore.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great strategy for parents with young adolescents, because I know I'm working with 6th graders, and what I often hear from them is, gosh, I wish my parents had more interest in my online life. And I always tell parents, I think that window is a really tiny window. I think that closes very, very fast. And so take advantage of like that little time when they're willing to, like, I'm trying to figure this out. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm feeling. I think that strategy would work great with that age level.
I love that you give that advice. And like, one thing that's really concrete also that I think most of us don't even think to do is asking about the positives. Like, adults so often just go right to here's what's bad, or here's what's negative, or like this kind of lectury mode. And one of the things that has been such a game changer for us in our own conversations with teens is recognizing the power of starting by asking them, like, what do you love about your favorite app right now? Who are your favorite people to follow? Like, just because it's a signal to them that we know that there are upsides to this world. We know there are things that are exciting and interesting to them. And we learn so much from that. But then it also, like, once we get into the challenges, it's just set a completely different tone for the conversation.
Yeah, I have to jump in on that one too, because I ask that of the kids all the time. And I always like, what influencers do you like? And they throw names at me so fast. And every year, a whole new slew. And I want to like, hey, wait, a little slower. Let me write these down.
We do this. We are often in the same position. We're like, wait, how do you spell that?
Have them write it on a Post-it if you're
exactly.
Right?
Text it to me, would you? Text me the names so I can look them up, Google them when I get home. Okay, I'm gonna go to a topic that I'm very interested in talking about. I hope that's okay, Pam. I think it was my turn, but sexting. So I really enjoyed reading your chapter on sexting. I have a lot of questions about it, but I'm gonna read this one line. I think I wrote it here. Teens want from adults recognition that sending nudes is, in some contexts, part of teen culture. So who wants to address that topic? So, and so parents aren't freaking out about that.
Okay, I'll kick it off, and we'll try to include some of the things we learned from teens, and then maybe Emily will jump in. We'll talk about some advice, some things that teens told us that we need to let adults know, that they want adults to understand. So first, I'll say, we are both moms of daughters. I have a 17-year-old and a 12-year-old, and Emily has younger kids, but they'll grow up to be teens. And so, we feel the sense of angst around this topic and the sort of fear and uncertainty. But we learned so much in listening to teens talk about this. And so, big picture, we learned that, as adults, we often use one term to talk about sexting, but that glosses over the different forms that it takes, the different feelings teens have, and it really is a spectrum. In our sexting chapter, we name 9 reasons why teens sext, even when they know it's risky. And one of the big headlines from talking to teens is they know that it's risky. So along with other things in digital life that adults often assume they don't appreciate the risks of, this, like the digital footprint, this is one where the risks are very clear to teens, but the reasons why they make the decisions they do are much more complicated. And so there are different feelings that they're having. So that spectrum I'm talking about, on one end of the spectrum is really consensual, wanted sexting, perhaps in the context of a trusting relationship. And we heard stories from older teens who talked about this. And then part of the calculus for a lot of teens is that they know lots of situations where sexting was consensual, wanted in a trusting relationship, and there were zero bad consequences. So we have to be alert as adults that even though teens are aware of the risks, they also hear lots of stories about things going okay. We also heard from teens about the more non-consensual forms, about things being forwarded without permission to a large group, about feeling a tremendous amount of pressure to sex. Girls who were getting requests from guys they wanted to feel closer to and didn't know how to respond in a way that, that was attentive to some of the risks, but, could build a relationship. Boys who didn't really want to ask for sex, but heard from their peers that this is the kind of thing that you should be doing. So that kind of spectrum, like really tuning into the array of complexities behind teens' decision-making, was really powerful and eye-opening for us. Emily, do you want to say a few things about what teens told us?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll say one thing also, which is that we really heard about pressures that can leave teens feeling like really trapped or like there are no good choices. And I think this is really important for adults to understand. So an example might be like, I've sent a sort of revealing picture in the past, and now the person who I sent it to is threatening to leak that picture or tell my parents if I don't send something that's even more revealing. And so suddenly I'm feeling like I have no good choices here. And I have all this shame that maybe prevents me from admitting going to an adult for help and navigating the situation. And so just like recognizing that there is this spectrum, and also that there are these really tricky positions that some teens are finding themselves in, I think really does, even though this is extremely uncomfortable for many adults, it feels like a really important part of helping teens navigate this context. We talk about that like culture around sexting in part because there are so many interesting ways that we heard about teens getting implicated and involved in sexting issues, even if they themselves are not sexting, which kind of gets at that cultural piece as well. And I actually had a conversation recently with a parent and a teen, and the parent was like, my daughter is definitely not sexting. Like, I don't need to have this conversation with her. I know we talk about everything. Like, I would know if she's sexting. And then I was talking to the daughter, and she's like, well, that's a little, like, I was asking her some questions. She's like, it's a little complicated. Like, I don't sext, but I have all these nudes on my phone. And her mom was there, and her mom's like, what? And she's like, and it was not what you might be thinking. Like, she had nudes from her girlfriends who were, her best friend was basically sending her nudes to have her check them, to say, like, do I look good enough? Is this a flattering picture? And so suddenly she was very implicated in this landscape of people having nude pictures, even though that might not be what your mental model is when you think about what you need to talk to about your teen. But that's really important because all of a sudden she now has these images on her phone. And so we feel like these are conversations that everyone needs to have. And we'll say in particular, teen girls especially told us, we're very sensitive about the gender dynamics and also not drawing a, gender's a spectrum, not drawing a false binary here, but we also heard really important gendered ways that these dynamics play out. And girls especially asked us, please, instead of just repeating in our interventions, don't sex, don't sex, don't sex, tell parents of boys, tell boys, don't ask for sex, because as soon as we're asked, we're in this tricky position, especially if we really like you. And why is the onus always on just don't send the picture instead of like, don't ask for the picture? We also, Carrie and I have really grappled with like the landscape legally in the US is a really important part of this conversation, because in some places, like in Europe, there's been, I think, more momentum around conversations about the idea of like, should we be teaching safer sexting? I say that term, and I know that some people listening will be like, what? Safer sexting? That sounds like a terrible idea. But, there have been pushes from some scholars and some practitioners for things like, we need to be telling people, like, if you're going to send a picture, it should never have your face in it. And those recommendations, I think, get very complicated in the US, where actually we don't have federal legislation. And so a lot is left to states that have variable legislation, and to, frankly, a lot of times, like the discretion of the district attorney or the person prosecuting. And so for Carrie and me, I think it feels very complicated to even engage with what it might mean to go down that path, because we recognize that the legal landscape is such that in some places you taking a picture of yourself can be considered the creation of child pornography. So these are some of the kind of features of the landscape that I think we try and pull back and uncover.
Yeah, I love that story that you shared, because it really hit home for me, because I teach sexting as part of the cyber civics curriculum. I do it in 8th grade, which I think is late, because by 8th grade, nearly every kid in the class has either been asked or heard of someone been asked for a sext. But what comes up for me, and I think is really important, is just teaching kids what sexting is, because like you said, Emily, kids that I teach don't understand that just having that kind of image on your phone is considered sexting. And so to just give them the laws, and it's a civics lesson, like, what is the law in your state? Let's look it up. You know, this is what the federal law is. Why is it considered pornography? And you can give kids all that information without passing judgment on them on, are they good or bad because they sexed, you know, whatever. Just give them the lay of the land, because kids are pretty smart. And once they know that information, I think they make better decisions for themselves. But I think not addressing it at all is such a mistake. And, you know, it's great for parents to do it, but honestly, a lot of parents don't know all the things you just said. So I'm really,
we didn't know those things a
Yeah.
year and a half ago. It was like,
Yeah.
but I appreciate your perspective so much. And I think I love the angle of the civics kind of approach. The Cyberbullying Research Center has this like really cool interactive map where you can look at the sexting laws in different states. So for people who want to do that, I also really appreciate that you just said that the students you're working with in 8th grade, like that feels too late, because I think that we agree. And also like that's something that many people who have not probably tried to have these conversations with teens think 8th grade sounds early. And yet I think those of us who have started having them realize like we just have to have them, like with pornography, like we have to have these conversations earlier than we think we do.
I think that's such a good point, particularly since you say, you know, teens are aware of the risks, but we also know that young people aren't as good at evaluating long-term risk as they are short-term pressures. So there's a sort of cognitive development thing going on here. So the only way to really combat that, instead of trying to make them worry about something they're not worried about, is to arm them with these different strategies and this knowledge, so that you're empowering them to make smarter decisions that don't go into that emotional risk evaluation that they're not capable yet of fully discharging.
Yeah, I super appreciate that you raised that, Pam, because you know that prefrontal cortex is still developing, and even though in the abstract there's a recognition that something put out there can come back, and we know teens are alert to this, when they're in the moment of making the decision, other like emotions and other impulses win out. They're much more weighty, and so really thinking about how we can equip our kids with the strategies they need to navigate those situations. We heard from younger teens and tweens, like they really need language for saying no that feels really authentic to them. You know, just say no doesn't always work, but maybe there's like a humorous way to respond to a request for a sext, like sending a black square and saying like, this is a picture of me in the dark, you know, something like that. The reality is, you know, that having that language in their back pocket to use at that moment is really powerful.
and I think also having these conversations in person with kids, with the group that they're likely to ask each other for sex, you know, it brings it out in the open, you know. And then we know kids create their own norms. So to create a place where they can talk about those norms before they are put in the situation of trying to decide whether or not to send a sext, I think is really important.
There's a plug for cyber civics if I ever heard one.
I just think talking to kids, you know, in school
Yes.
about all this stuff.
Right, but I mean,
really
what you're
important.
saying is so important, that they need to be able to talk in their peers, so that they get that peer support. It isn't just a parent saying, well, have you thought about this? It's them having the ability to discuss with critical thinking, as well as their emotional responses, to see how their peers are responding and the dilemmas their peers are having, so that they don't feel like they're out there alone trying to make these decisions.
Yeah, a lot of important work that adults can do is really create the space for teens to have these conversations, create the space and the lean structures for teens to have these conversations with one another, where they hear different perspectives and where some of the stresses that they feel are unique to them are given voice to and normalized in some way. That's what we heard loud and clear from the teens on our Youth Advisory Council, that it was really powerful to connect with youth of a similar age, other teens who came from different backgrounds, had different identities, but in many ways experienced some similar strains and pressures and stresses, even if they played out subtly in different ways. It really normalized the sense that it's hard to grow up in this world, and we need these conversations with one another to find ways to navigate situations successfully.
Right. We're getting questions, and I want to stop and ask this one because it relates directly to this conversation. I think you guys could answer it really well. As the parent of a 15-year-old boy, I am really torn listening to presentations like this. So much seems to rely on kids being able to do the right things if properly armed with strategies. Where is the line as a society when this stuff should not be available because they are too young and have these levels of self-control? Too young to have these levels of self-control. How would you
Yeah.
address that?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for this question. I mean, I think it's true. Like Carrie, Carrie and I have been really interested in like, what are the strategies and what are some of the things that kids can do and what can parents do? And the reality is we are we are also very committed to advocating for policy changes and for more infrastructure shifts. I think there's been a lot of conversation about like what the right metaphor is for thinking about social media. Carrie and I were giving a talk last week and we had a parent say, look, well, isn't this like crack cocaine? And the week before, well, isn't this like tobacco? And like this like moment we had around the tobacco industry, and the metaphors we use really matter. And I think Carrie and I have really a metaphor that really resonates with our current understanding in many ways is this idea of actually cars. And if you can imagine in the early days of cars, like on the one hand, people being like, wow, this is like amazing transformative technology. And on the other hand, people are dying. Like this is really, the stakes are really high. And if you can put yourself in the period of this, like there was this period of time when we hadn't yet figured out the whole infrastructure that we needed around cars to live with them. Like we didn't have speed limits. We didn't have regulation of things like you have to have an airbag in your car. We didn't have driver's ed and driver's licenses. And by the way, we evolved to say like there is an age at which you should not be using this particular technology because the risks do not outweigh the benefits. It's an imperfect metaphor for sure, but I do think in many ways, like it feels to us like we are in this moment where we haven't figured out what the equivalent of the airbags and the seatbelts are. We have made a lot of progress towards the education piece, but we haven't scaled it in a really, in enough of a way that, as much as we need. And as a result, we're leaving so much on parents. And then if you have a kid who's like, 12 and their 12-year-old friends are driving, you're suddenly having to make a decision of like, should I try and teach my 12-year-old how to drive a car? And that just feels so challenging in many ways. And so I want to acknowledge, like, I think these broader questions feel really important. And Carrie and I think, and Diana and Pam, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think like we really feel like we're at this moment where so much more infrastructure and so many more societal changes and supports and regulation and boundaries are needed.
That's a great analogy. You put it so well, but how I would answer that is like, I find that kids are smarter than we give them credit for. And I see that personally, but I also got that from reading your book. What we've asked them to manage with their social life online with all the intricacies and things happening is astronomical. And by and large, our kids are, they're surprising me with their ability to, make these decisions and largely come out, I think, pretty good. I know that there's problems out there, but a lot of kids are doing pretty well online, I think. I hope
and
I'm
I
not
like
falling like a Pollyanna here, but
no, but I like the analogy of the car and driver's training, because I think that is important. And maybe the one distinction you would make is that it would be pretty hard for a kid to take your car out of the garage without you noticing, but kids have access to online through a lot of different devices. So even if you're concerned that a 12-year-old isn't mature enough to go online, not training them is more dangerous than training them, because they have friends, they have access, they could go to the library, they can go to an internet cafe, they can do all kinds of things to gain access to this without any training whatsoever. So it's very important to have these conversations, at least, sort of our shtick, is start early, start very young, age appropriate, and sort of build with these things, because you want kids not so much to know how to use the smartphone as to have critical thinking and to make judgments about their own safety. And so, I think that's a very difficult question. I have very little faith in regulators for picking the right way to control these things. So I'm a sort of prepare the kids, and then, hope that regulators can catch up with something reasonable. But, it's the kids we're trying to protect. And the only way to give them armor, in my mind, is to get them so that they're reacting with some kind of context and skill.
Yeah, I mean, we couldn't agree more that approach, starting early and building from there, is really important. Another thing that we know, and I know this to be true because I parent two kids who are really, really different from one another. They're not just different age-wise, but they're different in their strengths and their vulnerabilities. And so knowing them and knowing the areas where they need a little bit more oversight and guidance and support informs my digital parenting. It informs the degree to which I'm looking over one child's shoulder transparently, always transparently. And on the other hand, giving a little bit more autonomy and freedom, because I know they're going to come to me if something big comes up. So really keying our digital parenting approaches to the children that we have, the kids in front of us. And again, that does not let social media companies off the hook. That is a whole other set of issues that, and regulatory movements that we need to have in play.
A note on that, because I always say this to parents, we talk about social media companies should do more. And I think parents should do more, because we have to remember that our children are their customers. And if we're unhappy with the service we're getting, we need to speak up. We need to use our voices. So I think that we just can't say that enough, that it's not going to just magically happen unless we really push for it to happen.
Agree.
I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I want to be respectful. I know you guys probably have
Yeah,
many other things to do.
Minutes. Oh my goodness.
Are you okay if we go a little over, or do you have somewhere you need to be?
How about one more question?
Yeah.
I want to talk about digital agency, because I feel like that's where we've ended up at.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't know what that means and how do we do it. So if you could just tell parents that, and then we'll do one last takeaway after that.
Okay. So I'll kick this off and then hand over to Carrie. So high level, we couldn't really get away from the fact that it felt like so much of what we were hearing from teens about what was hard and stressful about growing up with technology was rooted in the sense of not feeling like they really had agency or control over, for one reason or another, whether it's because the design features are undercutting your agency around your habits, or because your parents are telling you be careful what you post, but meanwhile your peers are posting stuff about you or tagging you in stuff that you would never want online, or that is a bad idea. Or you feel like you're just between a rock and a hard place and making decisions around whatever the topic is, what you post or what you send. There were just so many ways that we kept feeling like teens were like up against these challenges, and they didn't, as a result, feel like they really were making decisions with a sense of agency. And that felt really important to us, because we know from decades of psychology research that agency is actually really closely tethered to our sense of well-being. And the flip of this is that when we talk about things like helplessness and learned helplessness, that those things are implicated in conversations about depression and mental health. And we started to feel like this was just something that we could not ignore, that actually we're asking these big questions about mental health for this generation. And we're seeing the ways that they're just again and again voicing around technology. It's not just their screen time that's the issue. It's like this sense that there are just so many things that are not in my control, and yet I'm trying to exist in this landscape. So that's kind of high level of why we came to see, why we started to think about this idea of agency being so important. And for sure, other scholars have written about this too. So, we're building on other works here, but we talk in the book about some of the threats to agency and also 3 different pathways for supporting agency. Carrie, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. In brief. So we talk about building personal agency. So this is really at the individual level and thinking about how teens themselves and us as parents can help them build that sense of control over, for example, their digital habits. And the key to that is being able to reflect on what habits are working well and what habits aren't working so well, and be able to sort of design experiments to try to change up habits, really put them in the driver's seat, recognizing that there are so many things in apps and devices that try to pull our attention to the screen, but there are ways that we can work with them. Other things we've talked about across our conversation today, giving them language to set boundaries with friends. So that creates a sense of control. Your empathy for another friend doesn't have to mean that you have no control over and can't take care of your own self. So that personal agency level, building skills and dispositions to navigate these complicated situations is really important. There is another level that we hear from teens about, which is collective agency. And that's where teens work together to have each other's backs. So we hear from teens about them going out for lunch together and putting all of their phones in a stack so that they can really focus on the people in front of them. So that's one way of being present for others. We also hear about different strategies like checking with one another before you post a video or a picture of a friend, really recognizing that they are co-authors of each other's digital footprints, and they have a responsibility to work together to take that co-authorship seriously. So that's really collective agency, turning to one another. And then finally, we talk about proxy agency or proxy agents, and this is where adults come in. So teens, minors only have so much power, but adults, we often have a lot more pull in designing policies in schools and making decisions about curriculum in schools and pressing for policy change, as Diana, you were mentioning. So we have to really recognize as parents, as teachers, and other adults with power, the ways we can use that power on behalf of our children.
That's great. So thank you guys so much. I mean, we could obviously do this all day long, but if there's anything that you didn't get out of today, please pick up the book Behind Their Screens. And I imagine the book's available everywhere books are sold. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It is available.
It's on
We
Audible.
hope so. It's available. Folks
Audible.
can look at behindtheirscreens.com if they want to see more information about the book and places where you can buy it.
Okay, well, thank you both again so much. Pam, did you have one takeaway today? We always end with our takeaways. What's your big takeaway for
Well,
today?
I think you guys have done such a fabulous job. And so I just want to remind parents that teenage years are very volatile and emotional on and offline. So it isn't like social media created all this social angst, but it certainly amplifies it. And so it really heightens the need for these socio-emotional skills that you guys have been talking about, the ability to set boundaries, the ability to put words to things, and feeling like you can take action. And those things are incredibly important. But I just want to remind parents, you could turn off every platform they have and they're still going to be upset about their friends. So you really need to empower them to act in that social world, whether it's on or offline.
Great takeaway. And we did get some messages of people asking us if this has been recorded. Yes, we are recording. You can find this starting tomorrow on the cyberwise.org website under chats. It's available as both a webinar and a podcast. And you can find all of our previous chats there. Next month is November 17th, same time, where we'll be talking about, do parasocial relationships with media characters affect your kids? And that's with CJ Lindsay, who's our resident kids media expert. He works with a lot of the biggest brands in kids media entertainment. So looking forward to that. And again, thank you so much, Emily and Carrie.
Thank you.
I learned a lot.
Thank you
Pick
so
up the
much for
book.
having us.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, it was so great to be here.
Really fun talking to you guys. And do pick up the book. There's a lot of great information on there that we did not have time to get to today.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks so much. Be well,
you,
everyone.
guys.
Thank you, Pam. See you all
Yeah,
later.
bye.
Bye-bye.